looking back now, and that we went from a school to playing in front of 70,000 people in the Finglas Park, in the biggest large in the park, having 3 hit singles, played the National Concert Hall, done numbers of tours, and had at one point 8 major record labels interested in us. One, 2, 3, 103, and action. Cover it there.
Funny, I was talking to my one of my twin girls the other night, and she was in a band in the 90s, and I was saying that I said I'm working with a guy, George, used to be in the 11 Runners. I heard about them. They were reggae based, very exciting. They were going to be bigger than U2. Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah.
My first introduction to the knowledge of the D11 Runners was about 10, 12 years ago when I was at a conference, and there was a musical artist there that sang, and it very much impressed me with his voice. But I was down looking at some tapes a little bit later, and looking at these tapes, I seen a tape, and it was Joseph and this singer. It was the same guy, and this guy came behind me and said, "Do you think that guy's any good?" And I said, "I don't know, I'm just looking at it here." He says, "Well, he's brilliant." And I said, "Is he?" "Yeah." He says, "Yeah, because he's me."
Yeah, Joseph had definitely got a unique gifting in that his voice was, I suppose, crowd stopping, you put it that way. He was a guy from the working class Dublin with the Dublin brogue and coming from Finglas, but yet he possessed this voice that was on par with anyone, really. That was international stars even at that moment in time in the history in which we lived. He was powerful in his voice, powerful in his character also, and he had a great mindset to try and progress.
And that sparked off a relationship with Joe Fitzgerald that was to bring me in touch with his other brothers, George and Pat, and the remarkable story of the D11 Runners in the 90s. And how that affected the Commitments, which was this film that came to Ireland, and affected us all. Because of the class of a Dublin group, and then that parallel with the D11 Runners. And I think it was really that inspired me to research more about them and find out that this particular group, with their style of music, and particularly with the lead singer, Joe, were on the cusp of big time. They really were. Okay.
The genius of George, that's what I would say. And what struck me about was how profound some of the dialogue that it sort of just percolates out of him, right?
Chapter 1.
the flats of Ballymun, Dublin, 1969. The boy watched the fight from behind a huge rock. Swords clash. The man in the green suit jumps back. It was a fence to the death. Then Robin Hood charged into the duel, holding tight to a smile in the face of terrible danger. A brilliant light burst upon them, blinding the Dark King, while our champion sprung into the air, pinning him to a tree. Little John arrived on a brown horse and picked up the lad from behind the rock. Meanwhile, Robin Hood stripped the king of his cloak and they rode off into the sunset. Joseph, my twin brother, and I sat on the floor clapping when our hero saved the day. We stayed there until Ma turned the telly off and the black and white picture decreased to a dot.
He spoke about people at one stage. I remember Jimmy saying it to me. We're thinking about it, and it sort of focused me a little bit on how we sometimes forget that this is what it's all about. It's about people. It's about communities. It's about, you know, a voice that is often lost and not heard.
The voices that were not heard were unmistakably those of the Dublin population in the early 20th century. With the outbreak of World War I during a decade of radical upheaval, it was a century of global change. There was increased usage of cars, radios, and flights. Back home there was also the Civil War, the War of Independence, and 1916. This left Dublin in utter ruin and extreme need due to the widespread poverty. The voice came up slowly. Take them out of the slums. Put differently, don't forget the people.
Sometimes I remind myself, George spoke about the man on the balcony talking about, yeah, but what about the people?
Yeah, remember the people, remember the people. I do, I remember the people, Georgie. Old Georgie, who lived to be 100, said to me one day, when I showed him a photograph of the corporation buildings. I remember the people. See, he didn't remember the buildings, but he remembered the people. Obviously, he remembered the buildings also. But whoever is saying that, there was that in that generation to remember the people.
And I have to sort of remind myself sometimes when you get caught up in the rush to complete something, are we looking back and saying, are the people with us? Sometimes why not? We forget.
So I lived in George's Pocket, which were new flats in town that were built in, I think, in 1969, and they were to replace the tenements that had stood there before the new flats were built. And of course, Dublin was one of the worst slum areas in Europe for many, many years, and the tenements at this stage were being demolished and replaced by new flats. But Dublin still retained that village feel. It was like we were bordered on one side, Sean McDermott Street, maybe you'd go as far as Ballybock if you were feeling adventurous, and on the other end, Capel Street. So between Ballybock and Capel Street, when I was living in George's Pocket, that was my world, and that was all we knew. And moving then to Finglas with fields and greenery and cows, it was a new chapter in your life.
Dublin. I was born in 1955, 18th of July. I was born in Irishtown, but my dad quickly moved from Irishtown to Santry. I have a memory of those things in the 60s that now seem like they've been taken into the nostalgic moments of the 60s. And the 60s then were, you know, times of music change. There was dramatic change in the 60s as related today, but I have that hindsight now. But back then, it was my present.
Solomon writes in the book of Ecclesiastes about a time to be born, a time to die, a time to be sick, and basically a time to heal. And yet, in many ways, from my perspective, the 1960s is framed around that particular text.
I was living in that time as my present.
Because it was a complete time for change. Go on. Sit down. This is Bono take again. Ernie. Here's a question. Have you ever heard of a place called Finglas?
Yes. Yeah.
And what would you say Finglas is?
Finglas is where my husband is from.
Is he from Finglas? What part of Finglas is he from?
East Finglas.
He's from Finglas East. What year did he move in?
In the, no, he was what, mid-60s, I'd say.
Yeah, would have been in
It was a new house on Ballymun Road at the time, yeah.
And where was he from originally?
He was from King's Inn Street.
Right.
The family lived in King's Inn Street.
Down the road there?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Down near Henrietta Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here I am, being swallowed up by the hungry tree. I used to live here in Constitution Hill, across the road here, and I played in this park here. This tree really caught me as a child, and I could swallow up a bench, and swallowing up this bench here, it makes me realise that nature always wins. Nature wins all the time. So it was a great way to be introduced to nature as a kid with this magnificent tree. We used to play football in here, and you'd see all these people going into that magic building across there. Didn't know what was going on. They were all training to be solicitors. Unfortunately, I never went in there to train. I suppose I was educated on the mean streets of Finglas.
George and Joseph Fitzgerald started life in the 1960s. The family lived in a basement room until they were moved to what would be the infamous flats of Ballymun. In the 60s, times were changing, and that was never more apparent than in the music world. Music had become a vehicle for social transformation.
When the Beatles came on the scene in the early 60s, it was like, there's the Beatles, and the Beatles were there in 61, 62, and, out comes, She Loves You, and then it was Rubber Soul, and then it was all this, and growing up hearing this music.
In the 50s was tenements, poverty, came from the flats. But I do remember, one of the big memories for me was John F. Kennedy coming to Ireland. I was actually in an ambulance.
Eisenhower, in a sense, was a man of his time. But yet Kennedy brought more to the table in the fact that not only did he represent modernism and a renewal from the war and all that took place in the 40s, but yet he also manifested the very thing which he represented, which was modernism and brand new bright future.
But then the Americanisation, coming up, hearing about, I remember particularly John F. Kennedy in 1963. I was 8 years of age.
On the way from Our Lady's Hospital, heading over to Blanchardstown with a diagnosed primary tuberculosis, and the traffic, I remember the guys in the ambulance were giving out, the traffic was all over the place because of John F. Kennedy.
He was coming to Ireland, and I remember being on the Swords Road with a little American flag, waving it, and I can see him, as close as I am to you, I can see him. He's all tanned, he's got this sandy coloured hair, and, it's an amazing time for Ireland.
It's funny when you think of those times.
That moment in time, a lot of things was taking place. The birth of something else was coming, and that was coming through the music of the 1960s.
It is impossible to exaggerate the importance of music in this decade. It was a potent force for change and a mirror of the times. From the British invasion of the Beatles to the deep melodies of Motown, from protest songs to psychedelic rock, each genre influenced the course of civilization. Music became a really revolutionary medium for voicing dissident viewpoints on civil rights, war, and the environment.
The 1960s, the global economic boom, the population growth, and the development of civil rights groups marked the decade. The first man set foot on the moon, the first heart transplant in South Africa in 1967. In 1968, Robert Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King were slain in a decade defined by the Vietnam War, which also sparked anti-war protests. In the 60s we'd see the rise of a young boxer called Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., who would go on to be known as Muhammad Ali.
I'm Michael Daly and I'm the presenter of Making a Difference on 92.5 Phoenix FM and the author of many books. Growing up in Dublin in the 60s and the 70s, Ballymun was to be the answer to all the social housing problems. And on paper, it was a great concept. It was a brilliant concept actually. And it was to be the leading way to go in Europe. Now that's notwithstanding that they've been told by the UK this isn't the way to go. So what led to Ballymun and the building of the flats and the houses at that time? The fact of the matter was we were coming out of the 40s, 50s and into the 60s and there was nothing. There was no money, there was no work, there was nothing happening in Dublin at that time. And indeed, there was nothing happening in the country.
My thinking is that in order to really clearly understand the situation in Dublin in the 60s, we've got to understand what went before it.
And what happened was you had people coming up from the country to Dublin to get work, make a living, make a life. Wasn't happening for them. So it was emigration, huge amount of emigration. And that was the answer. So they didn't just see it as a housing problem. The social problem was much bigger than that. So what they did do was give us our secondary education, free education. Donegal O'Malley. A lot of charisma at the time went for it. I'm not saying I support his politics or anything, but he did go with secondary education and we did go with developments like Ballymun. And it was coming from a time when we had nothing. But the one difference between then and now, back then they did build houses.
I can still remember, even as a child in the early 70s, looking back to the neighbourhood in which I came as I played in the open fields of Finglas in the streets. And before I ever wrote anything, I frequently wrote down or jotted down letters in my own mind, unpublished work on maps and art and all the things that I became friendly with in the secret place, in the solitary place of my own bedroom. And as a man I often walked back to the neighbourhood in which I came from and stood there, looking, conjuring up thoughts and ideas and trying maybe, I suppose, to look for the little boy that was once me. On my last day in the flat of Ballymun, I stayed it sort of this way. I talk about leaving the flat and hearing the noise coming from the basement that sounded like friction of leather rubbing off the hard tiles. I heard heavy breathing that appeared to be coming from boys who were fighting. I listened with interest as I crept my way in. When I saw two boys fighting and I heard a wailing sound, it was coming from a small fat woman. She looked like a washerwoman dressed in an apron. The boys were gaunt in appearance, dressed in dirty clothes. Only bristles for hair. A middle-aged man who was as long as a tree stood between them. He had a long coat and a cap. He looked very drunk. One of the boys slapped the man, and when he failed to get any response, he kicked the woman. The man fell to his knees. I thought he was going to say a prayer, but he cried instead. The heavy-set woman also wept bitterly. The man then rose and rushed towards one of the boys and lifted him so that his feet could not touch the ground. Then he walked him straight into a wall. My name came to me in a whisper. I turned sharply and saw Joseph. "Come on, man, Dad's looking for you. We have to go." So we backed out of the darkness and into the light.
let's fast forward and talk about some of the good that came out. A lot of good, as I say, came out. One area that we came out and we punched way above our weight, not just in Dublin, but throughout the country, and some would say throughout Europe and possibly throughout the world. It was the time of U2, it was the time of Aslan, it was the time of creativity and music and bands. And you remember too back then, the Commitments. The Commitments put us on, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. But you also had another band that came out at that time who should have really surpassed them all, and that was the D11 Runners. And that's a story we'd all love to know, and one that we'd all want to get right behind. So at that time, people seen music as their way out. They seen music as their way to get out and get into the big wide world that was out there. And they seen it as an opportunity to not only show their creative side, but to show all that was good from their communities. And equally, Dublin wasn't big enough for them. It had to be England, Europe and the world.